Welcome to Mysterious Goings On. We're going to get right to the show after these messages.
This is E.J. Findorf, author of Blood Parish, and you're listening to The Mysterious Goings On.
When Cassandra Lane finds herself pregnant at 35, the knowledge sends her on a poignant exploration of memory to prepare for her entry into motherhood. She moves between the 20th century rural South and present-day Los Angeles, reimagining the intimate life of her great-grandparents, Mary Magdalene Magee and Burt Bridges, and Burt's lynching at the hands of vengeful white men in his southern town. Her book, We Are Bridges, turns to creative nonfiction to reclaim a family history from violent erasure, so that a mother can gift her child with an ancestral blueprint for their future. Haunting and poetic, this debut traces the strange fruit born from the roots of personal loss in one Black family and considers how to take back one's American story. We are very honored to welcome Cassandra Lane to the show to talk about her book. She is a writer and editor based in LA. She is winner of the Louise Merriweather First Book Prize and author of We Are Bridges, as I just told you, which NPR calls a stunning contribution to what must become our collective memory. She received her MFA from Antioch University, LA. Her stories have appeared in the New York Times' Conception series, the Times-Picayune, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and elsewhere. She's editor-in-chief of LA Parent Magazine. And most importantly of all, she's a guest right here on Mysterious Goings On. Cassandra Lane, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am so excited. I want to tell you something about me real quick, okay? And it's not what I said offline about just coming back from the gym and needing a shower. Okay. as we are here talking about this, I'm from Oklahoma originally. I don't live there now. And of course, there has been renewed interest about the Tulsa riots and what happened there, what amounted to almost complete erasure of this thriving, wonderful community. And I wanted to say this to you because not only is that timely, but as someone who grew up in Oklahoma, I never learned about it in school.
It's amazing.
It was erased from memory. It was despicable. When I became one of my first jobs, I was a beat reporter for the Tulsa World. I moved up to Tulsa. That's the first time I heard about it in passing. That was it. Very much in passing.
Unacceptable.
It is unacceptable. And that's that I bring that up because I want to ask you about erasure. And I want to ask you if that is the thing that you're most pointed at with your memoir and with your work is trying to counteract this despicable act of erasure of Black culture and Black history.
It absolutely is. And in fact, the book's been through so many different iterations, but what I finally settled on for the opening to the book was myself and other kids in the classroom, all the lessons that were taught, all the history, all the literature, and so much of it was not there. So much of my people's history was not there. In fact, I grew up on the side of a street called Beauregard, named after a Confederate general, PGT Beauregard, and didn't, make those connections. But it's my question in opening with those scenes is, what does that kind of, erasure do to a psyche? What did it do to our sense of self and value, our sense of worth? And as I got older, I learned little tidbits about what had happened to my great-grandfather, Burt Bridges. But it wasn't until I was 30, had left Louisiana for the first time in terms of living away, that I became obsessed with the story. And there just wasn't much there in terms of paperwork and research. So I wanted to write about that gap, those erasures, and what that does to a person's psyche.
You do
Absolutely.
say in your work, you say the more folks bury a thing, the more they sweep it under a rug, the bigger it becomes, the filthier it becomes, the more it demands to be raised.
Yes. Yes, I do believe that. Um, and it was, it was a metaphor my grandmother talked about. She was such a cleaner. She, tried to instill that in us as girls, and we resisted it. But her point was, you can sweep and sweep the crumbs under the rug, but I can come and pull this rug up and find them. And so she was physically doing that in that scene, and of course that is also a metaphor in my philosophy to life as well.
Yeah, it's. Let me ask you before, as I mentioned in the introduction, the germ of this, or the beginning of this, the kernel was when you were with child, and you had made a determination that I'm going to make sure that I gift my child with as much of our family history and as much of our cultural history as possible. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. The good, the bad, the ugly, in terms of what had been done to the family, what the family had done, to itself. That's my own personal journey and mission. It's not the stance that everyone takes, but I absolutely wanted to be able to pass something on to my son that felt, substantial, that had some sort of, record to it, at least putting these people's names down in ink and what I remembered about them. By the time he was born, of course, they were all long gone. My grandparents and my great grandmother, whom I remember very well. So and there were no recordings. So I had to bring to him the texture of their voices, the food. And the food is at least something that I can recreate in my kitchen, which he absolutely loves. Being an LA boy growing up out here around no blood family, but those stories, their voices, their idiosyncrasies, their joys, their failures, those are things that I wanted to get down into some sort of story form. And hopefully he can enjoy that. He can pass that on to his kids if he becomes a parent, and so on and so forth.
I, there's always these things I always attribute to family lore and my family. I know it has to be, that's where these stories from your own. You've heard these bits and pieces, and they of course, in my family, at least I'll speak for my family, they get embroidered a bit and things, get
Yeah.
changed. And,
Yeah.
if you grow up in Oklahoma long enough, eventually you'll find out you had a Native American ancestor that you really never had. So you have that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the Elizabeth Warren thing.
Oh,
But
goodness.
it does happen. It does. I mean, we thought for years but what it turned out is that I believe an ancestor, his second wife was Native American, but they did not procreate with together. So
Okay.
not related technically. It's just by by marriage. So, but the point being, all this lore can kind of get up. So, was there a lot of stuff that you just heard when you're pulling all this together? And did you find, as much as possible, did you find a lot of things that maybe weren't exactly the same, or was it maybe, especially considering what happened to your great grandfather, far worse? Or can you talk to us a little bit about what you uncovered?
Yeah, specifically about the lynching. That's that
Yeah.
part of the story. So I
Yeah.
first started hearing my grandfather, my mother's father, after he was forced to retire as a logger, just due to his cataracts and old age. And he didn't have any hobbies. And he retired, physically to his recliner. He would eat breakfast and then he would go to his recliner and sit there and sulk and go over his entire life. And, all the bad things that had happened to him, the things that he'd done that he wasn't proud of. And he always ultimately came back to the story of his biological father, Burt Bridges, and how he never knew his daddy because the white folks lynched him. I, being a kid, didn't understand, what that was, what had happened. I wondered, why is this 80-something-year-old man crying about all these things that happened in the past? Who was his biological father? His stepfather, was abusive, and so he would cry about that. So those were the first seeds that I got as a kid, just hearing my grandpa. And the other adults in the family didn't, explain it. They just kind of ignored him. So though, in reflecting back on that experience, I did later, as a college student, ask my mom, who was Papa's real daddy? And I think that was because I started listening to Billie Holiday. That's where I was first introduced to Billie Holiday's work. My family's very religious. They played all gospel in the home. So there was no blues, no rhythm. none of that in the home, played in the home. So I didn't hear Billie Holiday sing Strange Fruit until I was a sophomore in college. And I was haunted by that song. I played it over and over, much to my roommate's dismay. And I wonder, like, why am I so haunted by this? And I remembered my grandfather's tears, sobs about his father. And that's when I started asking my mother, who was Burt Bridges? What happened to him? Unfortunately, by then, great grandma Mary was already gone. She died in 1982. And all my mother had was his name, his first and last name. She remembered Grandma Mary saying how beautiful he was. She remembered Grandma Mary crying about him even on her deathbed, but she would say those little pieces and then shut down. She just didn't want to reopen that wound all the way. She would just talk about how proud he was and how the white people didn't like it. It was a little town in Mississippi, in Holmesville, which is now a ghost town. So those, and then I talked to an uncle who had pretty much it was that same repeated information over and over, just with those few select family members.
I am so moved. I obviously didn't know this person, but he was in his 80s and he was still not just misty-eyed, but sobbing about
sobbing. Yeah. And my grandmother would just start singing some old hymn just to try to lift the mood in the house. For some reason, and I'm the oldest of 5, but I hung around the old people. So while the other kids were out playing, I was sneaking around listening to what they were doing.
I did the same thing. I did. I mean, it's seriously, I'm a writer too. So I mean, right? It's just how we're built, I guess, right?
Right.
But this, I bet you're in the same boat here, because I would ask some probing questions that were hurtful, and I could tell because of people who died. And I had an ancestor who was murdered. And to this day, my mother cannot talk about that. And it's, you bring it up and and my dad is not going to sing a spiritual. He's just going to leave the room if we start talking about it. You know what I mean? It's so hard when, your generation, I shouldn't say ours, I'm way older than you, but our generation.
We're the same. Trust me, we are.
Get out. You are not.
I turned 50 this year. Yeah, I did. I embrace it. I want to live. I want to live long.
No, I embrace it too. It's just, how do you never, you know what, I'm verging on being not impolite, but improper. So folks, you can't see her, but I never would have guessed. Okay. So
thank you.
Well, where was I going? But we're talking about that, and you're pressing on that. So I kind of, if we could take a little side alley here, though, just as the writer side of you for a moment. You wanted to be a writer from a very early age, correct?
Yeah, I did.
You wanted to be behind the scenes and stuff, right?
I did. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, I was so painfully timid, so shy. And I loved listening, but I loved people, and I loved, like I said, lurking around. I loved reading. Reading was a way for me to feel connected. I kind of always felt like an outsider, the family and groups at school, whatever. And I would see my mom after her very stressful job and after her divorce. She would just shut up in her room and read her romance novels. And I loved, even when I was much younger, just watch just a picture of her being able to relax, being taken away into these other worlds through these other characters. And I think that's what first drew me to reading, embracing reading as this love, because I wanted to, that's just something you do with your parents do. So first I would sneak and read her romance novels from a very inappropriate age.
Were they the bodice rippers?
Well, they were a little bit more subtle than those. And they were the silhouettes and the Harlequin romance. Yeah, so more story, yeah. But still very racy for an 8-9-year-old. But eventually I found my own authors, age appropriate stories, and I just fell in love. And I knew something just said to me that this would be the way that I would finally be able to share my voice, even though I didn't like talking. And I told my mom around 10 or 11, I want to be a writer. I'm going to be a writer, but I want to be behind the scenes. And she was just like, what are you talking about? Behind the what scenes? No, I have no idea what I was talking about.
No, but I totally get it. Even as engaging as you are, I understand too. I'm the same way. But I mean, I think every good writer has that kind of that inner quiet that you
Yeah.
maintain, and that curiosity
Mhm.
behind the scenes. I love that. I remember that. No, can I just quote a little bit from your book? I want to just lay this down for listeners if I could. And I should have asked you to read it, but I'll do it real quick. So everybody forgive me. Okay. But you say this story is a hybrid, a romance, as we just talked about, a romance and a horror, a memoir and a fiction, forged out of what is known and what is unknown. And you go on to talk about it being a creation story for your family. Although what was lost, stolen, is long covered over by soil I will never be able to locate. And you just, when you're saying this further, when I was young, that was okay with me. The freedom of not being bound to the past, to all that heaviness. But I'm a mother now, and freedom means something else to me entirely. I am pregnant with questions, laboring over the unanswered ones tucked in the bosoms of our nation, our ancestors, our living families, and even into my own heart. Besides the fact that that is some beautiful, beautiful writing, beautiful
Thank
writing,
you.
I think it is such an encapsulation of what you're talking about here. Because I think a lot of us understand what you're saying about when you're younger and you're carefree. It's like, oh,
Don't
I
want it.
don't want to hear
Mhm.
all that. And you know what?
Mhm.
That was then, this is now,
Mhm.
but it's inescapable as you
Yeah.
mature.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. In my 20s, I was partying, having fun. I was a journalist. I was a newspaper journalist, but I was telling other people's stories, and then I could come home and enter my world of fun. Um, but there was something about those late 20s and early and 30, 31, where I knew that I needed to do a lot of work, based on some things that had happened in my life. And so I just researched, a therapist that I thought was a good fit for me. I was always I always journaled. I started journaling about my issues around romance, marriage, racism, the impact of it, what were my views about it. So I was just doing a lot of that internal personal work. And I think that there was something about that moving away from Louisiana, that helped me look back at my home state, in a more curious way, being out here in California, which is geographically very different, being torn away from, blood family. That just made me appreciate what had happened, and become more curious about it and how my story connected to those ancestral stories. So yeah, that investigation started around the early 30s. Absolutely.
Besides interviewing family, talking to family, did you have any other ways, any other assets you could go to try to piece this together?
Yes, I have lots of books here, about lynching in America. There was the first book that I found, Without Sanctuary. I became just so obsessed with, because it's a book of postcards, real postcards of people who were lynched, and people would take these pictures as souvenirs and send them off to friends. And so I would just pore over these images, one kind of trying to imagine Burt. Was he, an unnamed victim in any of these photos? Reading the essays that went with the postcards. And I was just mortified by it all. So that book for me, just visually, you can imagine something, but to see it visually, burned bodies, hanging bodies, and people in the crowd with children in their Sunday best, smiling for the camera. It was
Smiling for the camera.
horrifying. And it wasn't that long ago. So that was the first book, but then after that, I just started buying, any book that I could find. One is a collection of, newspaper articles, I think, over the course of 100 years. And it's just newspaper articles about lynchings. Sometimes the person was named, sometimes the person wasn't named. I have another book called Persons Unknown, which is about that, lynched victims who were not named. And then there's another book that I really loved, called The Lynching Plays, Strange Fruit Lynching Plays. So it's stories, plays that women wrote about lynchings, particularly about the survivors. And that's when I just, because at first I wasn't going to become a mom. I just thought I needed to work on myself, pursue my dreams, there was enough problems in the world. I'll help other people with their kids. But when I started doing that personal work and started teaching, and I loved my students, and that opened up something in me, I think maternal, and I started realizing why I had made the decision not to have a child and just really changing my mind about that. I really wanted to look beyond Burt and look at the women in the family because they were survivors. Grandma Mary was a survivor. She went on to live decades. She was a farmer. She was a laborer. She fed people who were poorer than she was. She was the most amazing cook. She raised their child. She was probably pregnant with my grandfather at the time of the lynching, and the women in her family married her off to distant cousins, saying you don't need to raise that child by yourself. They ended up moving to leaving Mississippi. Actually, part of the lore is that this second husband killed a white man in defense, and they had to flee Mississippi. I don't get into that, I don't think, in the book, but my uncle and my mom remembers it, that's, and again, it was very hush hush. But I remember my Uncle Cricket saying that they fled Mississippi, hid out in Mexico for a while before winding their way back up into a tiny town in Louisiana, which is how we all ended up in Louisiana. And Mary never went back to Mississippi after that. But the book, once I became pregnant, was when the book really took on this deeper layer of, this is not just about Burt being lynched, because at some point, you can only resurrect the dead for so long. There were no records. I called the state of Mississippi. All of the records in that town were burned. Or records from 1912 and earlier were burned. That lynching happened probably in 1904. I did take a trip out there in 2018. This got cut out of the book, something that I can continue to pursue, but I walked around that ghost town. I met a woman. I walked around a cemetery. I hired a longtime Mississippi historian who believes she found the same Burt Bridges on a 1900 census report. So I have, I see his name. It's barely legible, but I see a father's name, a mother's name. So there's more outside the scope of the book that I have found out and will continue to pursue. But becoming a mother definitely helped me look at it in a larger way by looking at what survived and how does a person survive and what kind of life did Mary create, after Burt was so tragically taken from her.
Barely legible. If you think about that, look how very tenuous his memory was, that it fell to you, his great-great-granddaughter, to bring him his memory back.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Right. And those little powders, that little powder. And great granddaughter. Or great. Oh no, great. I'm his great granddaughter. Got tripped up myself there for a minute. Yeah.
That's a huge thing. That's a huge thing. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about your son then. Has he read the book, or does he, you know what I mean? Has he legit read the book, or have you talked enough about the book, or did he live through you writing the book so much he hasn't read it, doesn't need to read it?
He actually thinks he's read it because he's been, he's 14 now. And so I've been working on it off and on over these years. So he knew that it was about, our ancestors. I've told him about his great-great-grandparents. When the book came out, there was that NPR article that you quoted, and it's pretty extensive. And my husband had picked my son up from school and said, "Hey, your mom's," he hadn't read the NPR article yet, but he gave the phone to our son and said, "Mom's in this article all about the book." And so my son read that on the way home. And, it was very revealing. There are personal parts in there that I talk about, things that he didn't know about. And he came home, he's like, "Mom, I thought the book was just about, great grandpa Burt. I didn't know you did this and you did that." I was like, "Oh, oops, damn." I didn't know you were going to read that article. And I thought you would read the book around maybe 16. In my mind, I thought, okay, those are some issues that we can deal with when he's around that age. But And I told him, I said, hey, I'm not a prude. I'm not a saint. I don't need you to think I'm a saint. These are some topics and themes that I was going to talk to you about, but we can start earlier. And we just kind of joked about it. So he's read a little piece and he's been listening more on Audible, but I'm pretty sure he hasn't finished. But he's talked to his friends about it and some family members. He's very proud. He's like my biggest cheerleader.
Well, he should be. He should be. But I've got a 13-year-old daughter, and I write mostly mystery fiction, and so she definitely does not need to read that, nor is she interested. But I always tell her, look, I'll be gone one day and you'll miss me and then you'll find me in these books. So go
I
get
love
those.
that.
Well, she will, because I'm not that great a writer. I steal so much from who I am and my own. Well, you're a sweetheart, but I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, there's a lot of me in those books. But anyway.
Yeah, that's amazing.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, and of course, as this is being aired during the holiday season, but we may have recorded it at a time when the largest statue of Robert E. Lee was removed from its pedestal. I would like to ask you, where do you think America is? It seems to me we are making some great strides, but it seems like when we lift these monuments off these pedestals, underneath these things are some very unpleasantness.
Yeah, it just reminds me of that rug that grandmama talked about. It's like all this dirt and worms and rodents and just all this stuff that we don't want to look at. So America just feels like it's in such a huge split right now. Yeah, there are amazing strides being made in terms of, these huge symbols coming down. The Black Lives Matter, the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement last year. So astounding things happening. But at the same time, it feels like we've taken 10 steps back on this other side. And so it's such a strange place to be in. And I think we all need mental health care. Seriously, because we're living through something that's just unprecedented. I mean, back then and during Jim Crow, that was the norm. Right. This racism, these atrocities. We went through the 80s and 90s thinking, we were post racism, some of us, in some ways. And now here we're so technologically advanced. We have so many wonderful things happening, with people of color at the heads of different companies and organizations. And yet there's still this mass Jim Crow mentality at the same time. It's mind-boggling.
I think one of the worst things about, well, there's a lot of bad things about social media, but one of the worst things is that you really do get a window into people who maybe your neighbor or a colleague at work, or it seems like to me 90% of everybody I went to high school with is a total jerk. I mean, I just
yeah, I went to high school in a very tiny town in Louisiana, and it feels like we're not even of the same planet. Yeah.
Do you look back on them and think, gosh, they were so nice to my face, some of these people,
A few, but I also remember, even though I grew up in an integrated school system, that there was, segregation. We didn't necessarily know each other. We were at different lunch tables. We sat on different sides of the classroom unless the teacher had class seat assignments. So really, I think my last friend in that K through 12 system who was white was in 3rd grade. And she came to school one day and said that my mom said, I can't play with you anymore. So, I remember her, because that was the thing about being in that small town. Everybody went to the same school. So I remember seeing her grow over the years. Just as I was growing, she was this cheerleader and popular, but we never spoke again after that. So we were all in our little pods.
And I know humans tend to stick to their pods, I guess, for want of a better term, but I just think we're all missing out on so much.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've gained so much joy in so much, and I think hopefully grown quite a bit, because I try very hard to step outside of my pod, my comfort level, or whatever. And I don't even just mean racially. There's religion. There's age. There, one of my best friends. I lost him last year. He's 30 years older than me, but he was my friend.
Yes.
And you're just missing out if you're just got that echo chamber mentality. And so I from what I've heard for your answer to my question, I get that it is kind of a 2 steps forward, 10 steps back kind of thing. Well, let me ask you this last kind of big question as we wrap up here. But I happen to believe that works like yours are beneficial and will help. They're part of this tide that will turn. I would like to know if you are as at least partially as optimistic as I am that eventually we'll find our way.
I have to be. I am what was the word? Somebody coined this phrase rather, that I was like, oh my gosh, that's me. What was it? Romantic pessimist or pessimistic something like that. It's like, that is truly me. So I don't know, maybe healthy dose of pessimism, but also I am a romantic, which to me just means optimist. And I try to, I think I've always kind of walked through the world in that way. I mean, being Black in America, being poor in America, you weren't born with rose-colored glasses. And so you see those things that are painful and hurtful and experience those. But at the same time, I think I was born with that hope and romanticism. And I've been able to continue because I see the beauty and the richness and the love in people from all walks. And I've experienced that. And so I can't, despite what happens, deny that I've experienced such love and joy from people, and that gives me hope. And we're still having children, so I have to have hope that we're going to have a better world for our kids.
Cassandra Lane, what I love about you the most, besides the fact that you're a brilliant writer, is that you chose to bring that hope from behind the scenes.
Oh, thank you, Alex.
Where can we find out more about you? I think you have a wonderful website. I think, you tell me if I'm right, it's cassandralane.net. Is that right?
That's it. Thank you.
And where can we buy this wonderful, wonderful memoir? Where can we pick up We Are Bridges?
Thank you so much. It's on all the online platforms. I love supporting our local bookstores. So you guys have a favorite bookstore, please, if it's not there, they have it online. They can get it in. Also, like bookshop.org as an online bookstore option.
You know what? I don't mention that one nearly enough.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cassandra, for reminding me about that. Is there any hint, since we're in the holiday season, of somebody maybe getting a shot at maybe an autographed book, or did I read that wrong?
Oh, absolutely. I would be happy to, sign and send it to you, or we could send it directly to one of your listeners. Absolutely.
I'll tell you what we'll do. If that's okay, I'll conduct it for you, and then I will send you the address. And what we'll do is, if let's make it easy on everybody. It's because it is the holidays and we're all so hectic right now. I will take this is going to be, for 3 days after this episode drops. Okay, everybody, you have to go to the Facebook page. I'll put a link in the show notes, and you have to they'll be pinned to the top under the link to Cassandra's interview. What we'll do, you just go in and you put your name and say something about the interview, and then what we'll do is we'll assign a number to every comment, and then I'll use a random number generator, and whoever gets that, I'll get a hold of you through the DMs and say, need your address to send to Ms. Lane, and we'll go from there. And if you don't respond in a day or two, then we'll go to the next number. Does that sound fair, Cassandra?
That sounds awesome. Great.
Oh man, I'd like to win that, actually. But you know what?
I'll send you a copy.
Oh, listen here, I'm a writer too. And if you sent everybody a copy, you said, I wish I could have one. The answer, you're so kind, but the answer is go buy one. Okay,
right.
I will go buy one. Cassandra Lane, again, your website is cassandralane.net. The book is We Are Bridges, a memoir. If you are in the market for a beautiful memoir, a beautiful story, well told, listeners, I recommend you get it. Cassandra Lane, thank you so very much for joining me today on Mysterious Goings On.
Thank you, Alex. I had a wonderful time. This was great.
You know, I love podcasting. I have since 2006, back when you had to use like a Dixie cup with string to make the thing work. And that's why I'm so excited that we recently moved Mysterious Goings On to Anchor FM to record our podcast. I gotta tell you, I don't regret it a bit. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Not going to lie to you, when I first heard about Anchor, I was a little dubious because I've been doing it the hard way for so long. But I got to tell you, it's very easy. Use a Stripe account. Get sponsors. You're not paying monthly hosting fees. The sound quality is great. The distribution is phenomenal. Friends, download the free Anchor app today if you want to start your own podcast, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Remember, you heard it here first on Mysterious Goings On. Thanks so much for listening to Mysterious Goings On. Don't forget, we have a complete archive of all of our interviews, monologues, updates, live readings, dead readings. All of that stuff is available at mgopod.com. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the usual suspects. Please join us there. Again, don't forget, mgopod.com also has links where to find me on social media and how to get in touch in case you want to be a guest here on the show. Well, I think it's time that I move on for this week, but until next time, keep reading.